Game Boy games that don't look like Game Boy games. You don't believe me, do you? Surely clickbait, there's no way you could mistake the original Game Boy for anything else ever, except maybe one of those shoddy knockoffs. Well, let's ditch the realistic filter and you're going to have to come with me on a journey here, but I'm going to show you some games that are very different from your usual Game Boy stuff in a fundamental way. Let's start with Monster Max. An action-adventure game with an isometric viewpoint, published by Rare and programmed by John Rittman with graphics by Bernie Drummond, all of whom had a close association with this now nearly forgotten genre. So Monster Max is a game with pedigree. It doesn't seem to have enjoyed that much commercial success at the time, but it got rave reviews from the magazines that did review it. Better than The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening according to some. Yeah, no, but it is a good game. I'm not sure I can bring myself to say it, but you might call it a hidden gem. Enjoyable as it is, this game definitely does look a bit home computer-ish. Maybe not a surprise when this game emerges from the same background as games like Night Lore and head over heels on the ZX Spectrum. Interesting to me anyway, it doesn't just look different, but the way it works underneath is quite different too. So much so, it's surprising to see it on the Game Boy at all. You see, most home computers of the era, even game-heavy ones, had some sort of bitmap display. That is, each pixel on the screen could be controlled individually, as a big grid of dots. Consoles though, including the Game Boy, tended to have a tile map display, and yes, this is another one of those videos where I say that word a lot. Great for 2D games, not so good for anything where the graphics don't fit neatly into a grid. And Monster Max's graphics definitely don't do that. That might not make much sense hearing it like that. Let me demonstrate what I mean. This is Game Boy classic Super Mario Land, a defining game absolutely and totally 2D and tile-based. Let's look at its graphics as they are being constructed. So on the opening level, if we go into super slow motion with an emulator debug tool and take a peek into the memory, we can see the graphics being laid out. On the left are the tiles, or the blocks that this level is made from, and on the right we can see each one being placed to make up the scene. In fact, here it's not the complete graphical data that's being copied, just a reference to the tile in the memory that's being put into the grid, letting the Game Boy graphics chip know what needs to be drawn at each part of the screen. But now let's take a look at the graphics for Monster Max being laid out. The display here is a bit messed up because reasons, but we can see something interesting. The graphics here are being laid out not block by block, but line of pixels by line of pixels. Instead of a bunch of ready drawn tiles being arranged in a grid, we have a sort of blank grid of tiles in fixed positions that the graphics are being pasted into, like one big canvas, squeezing the Game Boy's hardware into a sort of hacked together bitmap display. In fact, this is only the final stage where the data is copied to the video memory. The actual layout is composed in a buffer in the Game Boy's RAM. There's a sort of catalogue of objects in the cartridge ROM data, and the room is constructed from back to front, starting with the walls and then having the rest of the objects in the room laid over the top. That's what's happening when you move from room to room and the screen goes blank. Behind the scenes, the room is being constructed, first built in the RAM and then sent to the main graphics chip's video RAM to be displayed. But this isn't the only game of this ilk on the original Game Boy, and not the only one from a company with a bit of form in the area. There's also Altered Space. Programmed by Mike Follin with music from his brother Jeff, both pioneers in the British video game industry. This came out a couple of years before Monster Max and did things slightly differently. Here you might notice the graphics don't cover the entire screen, we just have rooms floating in white space. This leaves more tiles free to draw sprites with. Monster Max draws every object with background graphics. It doesn't leave enough memory to do it any other way, but Altered Space does use the Game Boy's hardware sprites. If we turn off the background layer and just leave the sprites showing, we can see how the protagonist is masked off when he walks behind an object. The bits we aren't supposed to be able to see are occluded. In a traditional 2D game, it's easy to make this work, but here, because the objects don't align to a grid, you need to cut around the sprites to make them fit. If we look into the memory, we can see the buffer where the normal sprite data is taken and has the appropriate mask added to it. Monster Max does the same thing to make the main character go behind objects too, but Altered Space makes use of the Game Boy's sprite capabilities to do the same thing in a different way, one that allows us to see what is happening more easily. I'm not sure this is quite as good a game as Monster Max, but it is still a decent and lesser known Game Boy adventure. It's also got an amazing soundtrack, but the weird thing is the music resets every time you change rooms, so you never get to hear that much of it. Why? I don't know. Maybe it was sibling rivalry, or maybe just a glitch they didn't have time to fix. But let's leave isometric adventures now and stay with bitmap displays and 3D and take a look at Race Drivin, a conversion of the arcade sequel to the maybe better known Hard Drivin, a very high-end arcade machine with what was at the time the most advanced 3D graphics you would see anywhere. I've featured ports of this game before. It seemed to end up on near enough every machine of the era, despite most of them being totally unsuited to a graphically intense game like this. The Game Boy's really no exception. It wasn't built for stuff like this, but somehow it ends up being, well, let's say one of the least worst home versions of this game, oddly enough. It's an impressive technological feat, it runs better than the Super NES equivalent, and again it doesn't look or work like your typical Game Boy game. Here, once more, we have a sort of a bitmap display made up from tiles in fixed positions, used as a canvas where things that don't fit neatly into a grid can be painted. This game uses polygonal 3D after a fashion different from the games we've already seen, but still something that can't easily be drawn with a fixed number of predefined tiles. Again, if we take a look at the graphics being laid out, we can see them being put down not as tiles, but as short line segments pasted onto the screen. Unlike Monster Max and Altered Space, this isn't grayscale, it's really totally monochrome, black and white only, pixel or no pixel. This helps to improve the frame rate. 1 bit per pixel shading is twice as fast as 2 bit per pixel shading, at least with the way the Game Boy draws its graphics. This game gets maybe 5 to 10 frames per second if you're lucky. It takes up to 12 frames worth of time for the display to be fully updated. But unlike Monster Max and Altered Space, the updates are not hidden as they happen. The graphics are first drawn in a buffer in the RAM with nothing happening on screen, but after they are constructed they are then copied to the screen memory, and this happens in 3 stages, usually 1/3 of the screen at once or thereabout. That's as quickly as the Game Boy can copy the relevant data around. This gives rise to screen tearing effects, but it still looks, well, sort of okay, but quite a lot like the ZX Spectrum version of Hard Drivin. Yeah, not identical, but there are some obvious similarities, and perhaps there's a reason for it. Race Driving was programmed by John Mullins, who worked on Spectrum games previously, and The smoking gun, Mike Day, who actually programmed the Spectrum version of Hard Drivin, is listed as an additional contributor to Race Drivin. Yeah, probably not a coincidence that they look alike, especially when you consider that the two systems have not the same but related CPUs. Maybe the game engine was adapted from one to the other. The Game Boy version is lower resolution, but it does run a bit faster, plus the tracks in Race Driving are more complex, so it's still very impressive. This was published by Argonaut, who, well, they did make quite a contribution to 3D games, going on to develop Star Fox for the Super NES, but this wasn't their only Game Boy effort either. There's also Days of Thunder 2, and well, time hasn't been that kind to Race Driving, but it's been even more unkind to this. There were loads of versions of this game for every platform at the time, and like the film they were based on, they were all, well, a bit shite, to be perfectly candid. Technologically though, again, this is impressive. You might think that coming out a year earlier than Race Driving, but from the same company, it could be an older version of the same graphics engine, but I really don't think so. They do look quite different from that, but fairly similar to yet another Argonaut game that I have covered before. It's X. Yes, published by Nintendo themselves, this is, well, it's pretty pivotal in their history. The game that got them going in 3D, a story I don't need to go into now. A game that led to big things in a roundabout way, and this again uses the same technique to make a sort of a bitmap display with tiles, and once again to make for faster frame rates it uses 1 bit per pixel graphics. A definite home computer vibe to the graphics once again too. There were tons of games like this on machines of the era, including Argonaut's own Starglider. You might still argue though that these games look more Game Boy-ish than anything else. And well, yes, technology aside, the Game Boy's colour palette and resolution is a dead giveaway, even more so on the original LCD screen. I could show you some other games that use this sort of bitmap rendering to different effect, like Populous here. I've no idea what's going on in this game, but it is hard to get away from the characteristic look, unless I do some cheating, which is exactly what I plan to do, a bit. Let's look at some more straightforward console-type games that look different for another reason. The Super Game Boy. A thing that plugs into the Super NES that lets you play Game Boy games on your TV. One of 5 official Nintendo products that could use original Game Boy game cartridges, but unlike later systems like the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, this is absolutely original Game Boy games only. It does allow those games to be gussied up a bit though. Older games can be automatically colorized, but quite a few were Game Boy Player enhanced with exclusive features. Castlevania Legends here is a fairly typical example. It's got a custom border and some extra colour, but some games did go a bit further. This is Donkey Kong from 1994. Yeah, I hate this overused term, but this might be a literal hidden gem. Nintendo seem to go out of their way to disguise what this game actually is and just how good it is. The name, the box art, even the opening stages would all make you think that this is nothing more than a remake of the original Donkey Kong arcade game for the Game Boy. That is just the kind of thing Nintendo would do, isn't it? But it's not that though, it's an all-new puzzle platformer that's really enjoyable. A sort of prequel to what Nintendo would do with the Mario vs Donkey Kong series in later years. It does also add not just a really nice looking border and extra colour, but better quality sound effects too when played on the Super Game Boy. This was the first game with a Super Game Boy support, and it seems Nintendo really wanted to show off what it could do without going overboard. That they did well, and yes, this is surely a Game Boy game that doesn't really look like a Game Boy game. The most striking thing here is probably the static screens between levels, making full use of the Super Game Boy's enhanced colour capabilities. The original Game Boy could have 4 shades of grey per tile, but the Super Game Boy allows that to be replaced with any 4 colours of the Super NES's huge palette, making very colourful images possible. Sadly, it's hard to move these graphics, meaning they're not much use for anything but static screens, but hey, they do look nice. The Super Game Boy was really a Game Boy built into a cartridge, the same CPU and other components, but it passes the sound and graphics to the Super NES where it's displayed in a window, rather than to an LCD screen and a speaker. The Super NES, for its part, passes back the controller inputs and can also overlay things on top, as we've seen. It came out way before the Game Boy Color, which can actually have more colours on screen than the Super NES, so compatibility with that was never going to happen. There are though some Game Boy Color games that are backwards compatible with both the original Game Boy and the Super Game Boy, like Wario Land II. These games in effect have 3 different versions of the game depending on what machine you play on. Both the Super Game Boy and the Game Boy Color having features that the others lacked. But still, if you do agree that these don't look like Game Boy games, you probably agree that I'm cheating by introducing the Super NES and Super Game Boy into the equation. So, if I am going to cheat, I might as well go big, because there is one Super Game Boy enhanced game that really looks nothing like a Game Boy game at all. Not even a little bit. Let's take a look at Space Invaders. This is the game running on the OG Game Boy, and it is an absurdly minimalist version of Space Invaders. That's all it is, a basic port of the original running on the Game Boy. Yeah, it's Space Invaders. But now let's take a look at it on the Super Game Boy, and well, as well as a nice border, we've got more options, quite a lot more. Select the Super Game Boy mode, and now we can play the Game Boy port in 3 different graphical styles. Monochrome, in actual black and white this time, but also cellophane style, which was how some versions of the original Space Invaders cab added colour, and a normal colour mode a la Space Invaders Deluxe. We also have some improved sounds too, making this really quite a bit different from the unenhanced version already. But there's more. Back on the main menu screen, we also have the arcade option. Hit that and, well, Space Invaders invade your Super NES. And this is the result. A game that totally does not look like a Game Boy game, because it's not. It is a full-on Super NES port of Space Invaders, hidden in a Game Boy cartridge, and only playable through the Super Game Boy. It doesn't use any of the Super Game Boy's capabilities, it's running from the Super NES's RAM. That's what the invading splash screen is about. It's loading the game's code into the Super NES. Yes, it's more of the same thing, Space Invaders, but a less minimalist port that goes even further to recreate the visuals of several of the different original arcade versions. It's full screen, full colour, even uses the Super NES's transparency capabilities, and has high quality samples. Another quite literally hidden gem, a clever Easter egg that's actually more than the game that it comes with. The Super Game Boy always had the ability to run code on the Super NES like this. There was nothing stopping developers from doing it, but this is the only example of someone actually trying it out. So this is where I'll end the video. For now, I think I've said all I need to say. Except, well, if you're wondering, there is, as far as I know, only one Super Game Boy enhanced game that uses the bitmap style display, and that is the not terrible but not wildly exciting Hexite. The shapes don't fit into 8x8 tiles easily, so there is some bitmap rendering done to get around that. There might be other Super Game Boy games that do something with software rendering like this, but I haven't found them. If you do know of any, well, do let me know in the comments. Of course, all the games I've shown will run on the Super Game Boy, and in fact maybe run a little bit better there. The Super Game Boy runs games a tiny little bit faster than the original Game Boy does, so games like X will have a better frame rate. Not much, but a little though. Nintendo fixed that with the slightly upgraded Super Game Boy 2, which runs at stock speed. Anyway, thank you as always to my Patreons. Your help as ever is appreciated. If you'd like to join them, there is a link below. And I will say goodbye and thanks for watching.